There's no two ways about it. We are in a generational economic slump. The labor market, as we all know, is in chaos. In February of 2025, the layoff amount in the US reached 172,000. It's basically the highest amount of layoffs since July 2020. And so what are we supposed to do in this sort of situation? And the larger question is, for those looking for roles and those entering the job market right now, is it possible that there are jobs out there that we don't know about? To answer that question, we have to understand the makeup of the economy. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 13 to 15% of the US workforce works for companies that have more than 1,000 employees. Is that surprising to you? Because it's mind-blowing to me. I would have thought that most people work for a large company, right? But what this actually shows is that 87% of jobs in the US are in small to medium-sized businesses, companies that you've never heard of. So store that data point in your mind. The second point I wanted to talk about is we're in a recession, right? And who actually gets hit the worst in a recession? First off, big employers, the government, Fortune 500 companies, those sorts of organizations. And that's what hits the news. That's why we're seeing so many reports about layoffs. The second category of companies are companies in cyclical industries. You might have heard of oil and gas or retail. Basically, in cyclical industries that have revenue that goes up and down over time, you have to overhire and underhire because demand varies. So when a recession hits, any company that's overcorrected and hired too much is going to have to correct very quickly. And so all of this begs the question, if 13% of companies and the government are really getting hit hard by the recession, who doesn't get hit? Who's in the 87%? The answer is the boring industries we overlook. First off, smaller industries. They're less likely to overhire because they have less overhead in their companies. They have to make do with what they have. They're not necessarily printing a ton of money where they can afford to hire a couple extra people. Think of like a 2-person grocery store. That's like an extreme example. Or think about a small insurance agency that has like 20 people, right? There's a lot of different companies like this out there. Also, there's a lot of companies that are like the mirror image of large companies. Think about a company that manufactures HVAC equipment, basically air conditioning units. Well, they might be worth billions and billions of dollars, but they have suppliers, right? Those suppliers may not have hundreds of thousands of employees, but they may have a couple hundred. They may have engineers, accountants, all the sorts of roles that you might expect in a normal business. Those businesses are the ones that are in that 87% I talked about. And the next group of companies that don't get hit as hard are companies in steady industries. Industries that are less cyclical. I mentioned the grocery business. I mentioned a lot of these other businesses that basically these are businesses that have to sustain people. Big companies have multiple subsidiaries typically that when they put them together, overall they can deal with the ups and downs. But small businesses are forced to be smart and steady over time. All right, so where do we find these companies? Well, I want to introduce a new term to you. It's called the long tail. If you've ever heard of the Pareto principle, summarized simply, if you look at various sorts of data out there, you'll find typically that 80% of the results come from 20% of the input. And what that means is, let's say, you're looking at a group of people that work in a certain company. Oftentimes, there's a group of 20% of the people that do 80% of the work. That doesn't mean no one else does any work. It just means that in many organizations and systems, you see this relationship that what is the 20% that really matters versus the 80% that doesn't really matter that much at all, right? And so what people don't realize is in our economy, we've applied this principle to almost everything. And so people tend to focus on the 20% of quote unquote winners in any situation. So if you look at the economy today, all the articles are always about how is Apple doing? How is Facebook doing? How is Google doing? All these sorts of things. They're the tech companies. Or in any industry, they're looking at the top couple companies because they're the 20% that moves the industry around, right? But The reality is there's a whole tail of companies and organizations that are never known. They're always overlooked, right? And what you realize, there's a lot of people that are very successful focusing on areas that are not in the 20%. I'll give you a great example. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger for many years were looking at, and to this day, they've been looking at the long tail of business opportunities. If you ever hear Warren Buffett speak, he always talks about spending extra time looking at different companies that are overlooked. Well, the way to do that is you have to spend your time looking in areas people aren't looking. Everyone knows about Google or everyone knows about these large companies, right? The same goes for finding a job or finding a company that you want to work at. Everyone's focused on the big guys, right? But what you start to realize is there's a whole group of companies that no one's really looking at. So the other question is, why are these companies resilient? Well, they're not as penetrated by technology. And the reason for that is they're not big companies. A lot of times they're doing things that aren't easily automated. And if you look at my other video on the tsunami effect, which I highly recommend you look at, these companies are less affected by the tsunami effect. So to summarize the tsunami effect, a lot of times when something gets popular or hyped, there's an overcorrection of people that go rush towards doing that thing. And so if you're a small company that isn't in that 20% that everyone always looks at, you're not really affected by these massive waves of people interested and then people leaving your company, right? The people who work at your company are in it for the long haul. And also, because they're smaller, they don't have as much buffer for hiring mistakes or frivolously spending money. These companies are managed more closely. So they're a little bit more resilient in some ways too. And then the people that are at these companies tend to be more adaptable because they're smaller, they have to do more, right? They have to do more things, but they're gaining a lot more experience. And so that kind of sums up the long tail. If you look at almost any industry, there's gonna be companies that are in that massive long tail that you've never heard of. So how do you go tap into this long tail? Let's say you want to get a job at one of these companies or you want to learn a little bit more about them. How do you tap into this long tail? Well, the first thing is this. Now, one of the ways to find these companies is to go to their websites. When you use a job aggregator to apply, what ends up happening frequently is you're competing against a bunch of people. There's a lot of people that they don't have nothing better to do and they're always looking for a slightly higher salary, so they'll just be applying to jobs. And the easier it is to apply, it's easier for people to just frivolously start throwing their resume at stuff. And all of a sudden, when it's maybe 10 people that are actually interested in a job, suddenly there's 1,000 people that, for no reason other than boredom, that you're competing with all of a sudden. So you avoid some of that when you go to a company's website to apply, right? The second way is in person. And this sounds absolutely crazy, but this is actually how people got jobs back in the day. They would bring their resume, they would dress up, and they would go door to door and see if they're hiring. And so you don't necessarily need to do all that, but if you find some companies around you, dress up, go, and just see if they're looking to hire. And I'll be honest, one of the companies that I was leading, we had people that we hired off the street like this. They would come in once in a while and they would say, hey, I'm looking for a job. And we're like, oh, cool. Do you have a resume? And they'd have a resume. And we'd be like, okay. And then the HR person looked at it and they're like, if we're good with hiring this person, we hired them. So one of the benefits of that is you're sidestepping this whole business of 1,000 people that you're competing against, right? You're actually making a real introduction. You're shaking a hand. People know who you are, right? You're already past the whole application song and dance, right? And you're avoiding the resumes getting stuck in the ATS, which is a whole nother subject, right? The first thing I would tap into is introductions. Maybe you're part of a club or organization or a church. These organizations typically have members that can give you warm introductions to people that are in industries that you're interested in. Now, the way to do that is you have to kind of put it out there that you're looking, but once that news makes it through the grapevine of the organization you're a part of, usually someone will be willing to help, and that's one of the benefits of being part of a community. And usually those people will know local companies that are looking to hire, right? And so that's usually the type of company we're talking about. A lot of these long tail companies, they're not necessarily in New York or LA or San Francisco. They are typically in your town and they're maybe down the street and you drive past them, you've never even seen them before, right? And then finally there's the unstructured application process, and that's a little bit harder to pull off, but basically you're networking with people and you're saying, hey, I'm just trying to learn a little bit more about what your company does or what this industry does. And, if you can make a good impression, you can start uncovering different companies that you're interested in. And then sometimes people get job offers that way as well. But those are 4 separate ways to essentially tap into that long tail. So just like people hype up the 20% of companies that are the biggest, sounds like I'm hyping up the 80% of other companies the same way. Is this actually better to work for these sorts of companies? Well, there's a couple of really big benefits. First off, the application process at these companies is usually less stringent. Like these days, if you go talk to a recruiter, which I have in the past, people are interviewing like 5 or 6 rounds to get a job, which if you're a company in the top 20%, you can do that because everyone wants to work for you. And if you're not willing to do that, someone else will be, right? So at a smaller company, they're not looking at it that way. They're like, hey, you live locally, not to say that there aren't difficult interviews at smaller companies. They're just not getting the same volume of applicants. They're happy someone's applying, right? And so similarly, this is tied in with the first thing, is there's less competition. So because of less competition, there's a less stringent application process. But in general, the less competition is obviously a good thing. You're able to land a job much easier as well. And because you're at a smaller company, you can start to wear more hats more easily. At a smaller company, there's not going to be a whole process necessarily for you to transfer to another department. If someone likes you and you do a good job and you know the business, you frequently see people jumping into other areas. Like, for example, there was a company that I was a consultant for, where an individual who was a leader in the IT department jumped to become a leader in their strategy department. Now, this company was big enough to have a strategy department, but the point is, that's not a typical jump. That usually only happens through a lot of vetting, and usually there's very strict pipelines on who gets into a strategy department. The point is, job jumping and jumping to different departments is a lot easier in smaller companies as well. And because of that, there's more opportunities to learn. So hopefully now you're ready to go apply to ABC engineering company down the street, right? Or maybe not. But there is one last opportunity I wanted to talk to you about, which is a long tail opportunity that no one else talks about. And you may have never thought of it this way, but starting your own company is actually the ultimate long tail opportunity, because you're not a big company, you can't get fired, you have unlimited compensation, and you can act on opportunities you see. Now, you may not win on the first company you start, but starting your own company helps you control your own destiny. And you start to understand that when you go to a bigger company, you have to be very, very specialized. And as you work for a smaller company, or even your own company at the other end of the extreme, you're able to learn everything. There isn't necessarily a barrier for you to jump into developing a product when all you know is marketing. And so ultimately, if you're looking at the long tail, that is actually how a lot of those companies started. Someone was an entrepreneur, they decided to start a company, and maybe now it's 20, 30, 100, 500 people, right? And so one of the benefits of starting your own company, obviously, is that it's the most flexible role that you could ever have. You can basically learn on your own. But obviously you need money coming in, and that's the real stressor there. So it always comes back down to trade-offs. Do you want more stability at a larger company? Or if you're struggling to find a role there because it's so competitive, do you want to go find a smaller company or even start your own? The one thing you'll start to realize about the way I look at things is I always like to find a hybrid approach so I can have my cake and eat it too. So a quick bonus for you: how do savvy people use the long tail to their advantage? Well, what a lot of people do is they start at big companies first, and then they move into the long tail because now they understand their industry better. They've saved some money up. They're willing to kind of go to a smaller company. They don't mind not getting paid quite as much. But one of the benefits of doing that is if you go and start at a big company, you have a lot of credibility because people always be impressed that you work for such and such company, which is the top 10 company in this industry. If you go to a smaller company, they're going to value that experience a lot. I've even done that in my own career where I worked for a OEM or an original end manufacturer where we assemble a lot of stuff. And I left that company to go work for a supplier. Well, one of the main reasons the supplier hired me was because they liked that I had experience at their customer. So there's that benefit as well. Well, one of the other benefits is if you start at a big company first, and let's say you go start a company that's smaller, there's potentially a lot of money in it, but it requires patience, and you have to spot the right opportunity to use all the stuff you've learned about a particular industry. So think about that as well. Think about spending the first part of your career in a larger company and then moving into a smaller company later. And then finally, the long tail, it applies to everything. And so we talked about jobs, but think about colleges. There's a ton of colleges out there, but you usually only hear about the top 10 or the top 20, right? Now, everyone's focused on that. Everyone's like, I want to get into an Ivy League school. I want to do this. I want to do that. If you start thinking ahead, though, there's a ton of competition in going after those schools. And maybe you want to have a couple of those schools just as a long shot in all the schools you apply to. But if you're applying to college, why not look at smaller schools that maybe they're not terrible, but they're smaller or they're lesser known? I mean, a degree is a degree usually, unless you get it from like the top 20 school. The other thing you see is people transfer. They'll go to a community college and then transfer to another school. That's like that hybrid option I talked about, right? But if you look at anything in the economy, you'll see this long tail approach or this Pareto principle being acted out, right? So the ultimate takeaway here is look at the long tail. Don't ignore it, especially if you're struggling to find a job. There's a lot of opportunities out there, especially if 87% of companies in the US are in the long tail. Hopefully this helps you navigate that journey a little bit better. And then lastly, what do you guys think? Is this something you struggle with? Have you applied to companies that are in the top 20 of your industry, or are you looking at companies in the long tail? Feel free to comment below.